Okay, good evening. I'm Liz Schaefer, coordinator of the Food for Thought programs, and I welcome you to our final Food for Thought for the season. As I mentioned, if you haven't done so yet, please silence or mute or turn off your devices. And please save your questions to the end. We will have a live mic here for our in-person audience. And if you're Zooming with us, there is an icon at the bottom that says Q&A. Feel free to type in your questions, and you can do that throughout the presentation. Tonight, we welcome Frances Karttunen, one of the premier historians of Nantucket. The thing about Frances is that whenever you have a conversation with her, no matter what the topic, you're going to learn something. Frances is a 1960 graduate of Nantucket High School. After college, graduate school, and a 30-year career in linguistics at the University of Texas at Austin, she returned home to Nantucket. The Other Islanders, People Who Pulled Nantucket Oars, was Frances's publication in 2005, her first publication. It focuses on some of the diverse people who were part of the whaling industry. Since then, Frances has published 11 more books about Nantucket history and diverse communities, her most recent in 2015. She's been active in programming for the African Meeting House on Nantucket, the Saltmarsh Senior Center, and our island home. And of course, she works closely with us here at the NHA. Frances was instrumental in bringing the exhibit, Shoulders on Which We Stand, about the Cape Verde Nantucket connection to the museum in 2021. Tonight, she will explore Nantucket's Portuguese heritage with us and help us understand how the diverse communities differentiate themselves. Please join me in welcoming Frances Karttunen.
Good evening. I'm so pleased to be here. I have a slideshow tonight about two different streams of historic Portuguese heritage on Nantucket. Of course, there's a third one now because we have a growing Brazilian community. But this evening, I'm going to talk about our two historic, very different streams of Portuguese heritage to Nantucket. There we are. So back in 2015, a very young man named Jazio Correa was elected as mayor of Fall River. As some of you probably know, he's no longer mayor of Fall River. But what's interesting about him tonight is that he identified himself as a son of immigrants, his father being Cape Verdean and his mother Azorean. And this bicultural marriage is somewhat unusual. The Azores Islands and the Cape Verde Islands are both located in the eastern Atlantic Ocean, but the Azores lie off the coast of Portugal, directly east of Nantucket, while the Cape Verde Islands lie off the coast of Africa. So there you can see the two different groups of islands and how far apart they are. If Nantucket whaling captains had confused the locations of these two islands, they would never have come home again. It would have been a disaster. But in more recent times, and by more recent times, really since Nantucketers stopped going whaling, Nantucketers have been chronically confused about these two different sets of islands. Now you may notice that things are getting color-coded. When I'm talking about both sets of islands, the background will be red. When I talk about Cape Verdeans, the background will be the blue of their flag. And when I talk about the Azoreans, the background will be the verdant green of their very beautiful islands. But here's a blue background, and this is about Mrs. Annie Gibo. She was a mother of 6, grandmother of 14, great-grandmother of 15, and she lived to be a centenarian. She was featured in the Inquirer Mirror twice, once on her 96th birthday and again on her 99th. And in both cases, the Inquirer Mirror said, Mrs. Gibo was born in the Cape Verde Islands, Azores. The first time they said this, they said she was born there in 1871, came to the United States in 1891 when she was 20 years old. And then in 1911, she came to Nantucket, where she lived the rest of her very long life. So 3 years later, they celebrated her longevity again, and the error reappeared uncorrected. She was born in the Cape Verde Islands, Azores, and has lived on Nantucket since 1911. All right. Comment. Just press it for me. Thank you. But there's an earlier case of the Inquirer Mirror getting it wrong. Captain John Murray, a Portuguese. We'll come to that later. He didn't start out as John Murray. But he died on Nantucket in 1899, and his obituary stated that he was a native of the Cape Verde Islands, even though he and his son, John Murray Jr., who was living here as well, had both been born on the island of Graciosa in the Azores. Well, apparently there was quite an outcry, probably from Azoreans, because the following week, the Inquirer Mirror said that they regretted that an error on our part as to the place of his nativity should have caused his friends annoyance. And yet, frankly, we have continued to annoy both Cape Verdeans and Azoreans ever since. Let me just do this. So these two groups of islands, quite far apart, were both uninhabited when they were discovered by the Portuguese. Nobody there. So they brought people in. And for the Azores, people from Portugal and also from Flanders settled on the Azores Islands. And as you can see, it just looks like a gorgeous green quilt. On the other hand, for the Cape Verde Islands, Portugal sent some Portuguese administrators to the islands. They sent some political prisoners, and they sent some people known as conversos, who were Jews who had been forcibly converted to Christianity, but nobody really believed that they were sincere Christians. And so they sent them off to faraway places, including the Cape Verde Islands. So they sent these people to the islands to run things, but they were all men. So the plan was to establish on these islands sugarcane and cotton plantations. Well, who's going to do the work? Well, enslaved Africans, men and women, were brought from the African mainland to work these plantations. Well, both Cape Verde Islands and the Azores are volcanic. They have active volcanoes that erupt from time to time, but the difference is the rainfall. The Azores get a lot of rainfall and they're verdant, but the Cape Verde Islands have long periods of intense drought. And the plantations that they managed to set up at all just could not produce enough to both support the population that had been brought to the islands and to produce surpluses that could enrich Portugal. And this is why. Lava landscape, a little bit of terracing, sugarcane planted up a hill. I don't want to misrepresent the Cape Verde Islands. There are beautiful places on all the islands, but the fact of the matter is that none of them could sustain the kind of agriculture that Portugal hoped would be producing lots of stuff to export. So the result of the fact that these plantations weren't going to work out was that they switched the economy from agriculture to the slave trade. So enslaved Africans were brought from the mainland of Africa, most of them on their way to Portuguese Brazil to work in the sugar plantations, which were flourishing in Brazil. But some of these Africans were kept on the Cape Verde Islands instead of being moved on. And in this photo, you can see a slave pillar on the island of Santiago, where people were displayed for sale. So the result was that in the Cape Verde Islands, where you had Portuguese men and fewer any women, the Portuguese men had children with African women, and in a very short time, in a generation, the population of the islands became pervasively of mixed race. So here's a photo of one Cape Verdean, quite famous singer, and two New Bedford Cape Verdeans who were visiting. And here we have the president of the Republic at that time in 2008, together with other bureaucrats interacting with the visitors from New Bedford. So this makes the population of the Cape Verde Islands markedly distinct from that of the Azores, which, as you recall, had been populated by people from Portugal mainland and from people who had come from Flanders. And there was next to no African admixture among the population of the Azores. So here's some pictures that I've taken in the Azores, a couple of guys on horseback. The director of a pineapple growing operation on one of the islands, and he was explaining to us how, unlike in Hawaii, where pineapple grows outdoors, in the Azores, it has to be grown inside of these greenhouses. And speaking of cultivation, although you have to tend your pineapples very carefully, hydrangeas have simply naturalized all over the Azores. They just grow wild everywhere. And I think really we can credit the Azorean landscapers who came eventually to Nantucket for the fact that we have our hydrangeas as well. So here, I showed you a Cape Verdean musician. Here are some Azorean musicians. So the people of these two groups of Portuguese Atlantic islands historically have a number of things in common. They have Portuguese family names, they're Roman Catholic, they enjoy a Portuguese cuisine, and they emigrated to New England in large numbers. They also have active volcanoes, but the distinction is that you also get a lot of rainfall in the Azores and get long periods of no rainfall at all in Cape Verde. Well, what about language? Portuguese, right? But language is actually a thing that separates Cape Verdeans from Azoreans, because Azorean Portuguese is somewhat different from the language of the Portuguese mainland, and it's also distinct from Brazilian Portuguese. But in the Cape Verde Islands, a Creole language developed, a Creole language that they call Creole, and it's not intelligible to other speakers of these other varieties of Portuguese. Creole uses many African words, and it also has a different way of making sentences. It has a different grammatical structure from standard Portuguese. And as a result, immigrants in America from these two island groups had to resort to English to communicate with each other. And as we have been interviewing Cape Verdeans, they lament that over just a couple of generations, the ability to speak Creole disappeared under the pressure of speaking English all the time. Well, the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands and Nantucket, another Atlantic island after all, were linked by whaling. Nantucket whale ships would set out across the Atlantic to the Azores, where they would take on freshwater supplies and they would take on some crew members, and then they would drop down to the Cape Verde Islands, where they would not take on more supplies because fresh water and supplies were not much available in those very arid islands, but they would take on crew members. So here's what they did. You can't really sail as the crow flies with the Atlantic because of currents and winds. So from here you can go up and over, but once you get over, you have to go down and around. So they would go to the Azores, they would drop down to the Cape Verdes, and then they would go off to whichever whaling grounds they were going, either the Brazil grounds or around Cape Horn to the Pacific, and eventually home. So Nantucket got out of the whaling business in the mid-1800s. There were some voyages in the 1860s, but it was a dying business here. It went on in New Bedford until about 1900, because New Bedford had a deep water harbor and a railhead, and large heavy ships could get into New Bedford, where they no longer could get into Nantucket Harbor at all. But it went on in the Azores for much longer than that. When we visited with an NHA group in the early 2000s, there were plenty of living people who had been involved in the whaling industry. And even today, well, what they've done is they've converted their factories into whaling museums. And instead of killing whales, now they conduct whale watching trips out of the old whaling ports of the Azores, primarily the islands of Pico and Fayal. So here's a view of whale boats at a whaling museum on the island of Pico. They're a little bit different from this one. The other thing in this picture is you can see all of this lava. Pico is a peak, it's a volcano, and there's a lot of black lava rock everywhere. And here in the straits between Fayal and Pico, you can see some marine mammals. The Cape Verde Islands, famine was so pervasive because of drought that people were really desperate. There once was a relief ship that had been sent out from Quakers in Philadelphia to relieve starvation in the Cape Verde Islands. And when they made landfall with the first of the islands, people rushed to the shore to welcome the ship. And they, according to the descriptions, all they could do was sort of croak and groan. They were in such terrible shape that they couldn't really speak. So naturally, if you had an opportunity to sign on to a ship where the food might be execrable, but there was food, you would sign on. And we had a food for thought talk last fall in which one of our speakers said that her grandfather had gone on a 12-month whaling voyage out of Cape Verde, and they saw not one single whale. And so, because you get paid in terms of, you know, your success, when they came back, the only thing that he had gotten was 12 months of being fed. The islands that were involved in this whaling trade were the islands of Brava and Fogo, or Foge as they pronounce it. And Fogo is an active volcano. And one of the ways that whaling ships could actually find their way there was that there were very frequent eruptions. And when there were the eruptions, it was like a giant lighthouse in the Atlantic. You could see it from very far away and steer there. But during these active eruptions, people on that island would flee for their lives across to this much smaller island known as Brava. And because they were picking up their crew members generally from that island, no matter whether the people were from Fogo or from Brava, Nantucketers just call them all Bravas. This is a harbor on the island of Brava. We have a vintage photo of it. You can see ships at rest in this rather open harbor. There's not a lot of protection from the sea, and also a picture of it as it is today, notably without a whole lot of vessels. Now, as I said, when you are traveling the Atlantic Ocean, you have to sort of make a circular trip. You can't just go straight across. So when Azorean and Cape Verdean crew members were on whale ships coming back from the Pacific, they round Cape Horn and they're headed up, they can't really just get right straight back to their island. So they would come to New England, and some of them would stay. But of course, they were all single men. So if during the whaling period, if a person from Cape Verde or from the Azores came and stayed here, they were single men. There were no families. The first Cape Verdean to be naturalized as a US citizen did so right here on Nantucket. The court records are right across the street. He had been born on Brava in 1794. And his name at that point was Jose da Silva. He was described as an alien being a free white person. And we look at that and say, really? But in order to become a US citizen, you had to be recognized as free and white, no matter who or what you really were. I think it's significant that he did not sign his name with a signature. He signed it with a cross. So he was free, he was white, he became an American citizen, but he was apparently illiterate. He described himself in the court documents as Joseph Silva, but he became known as Joseph Sylvia. He married a Nantucket woman and raised a family here on Nantucket. But Azorean men could more easily marry New England women and form families than Cape Verdean men could, because the Cape Verdean men were generally perceived as Black, even though they were very distinct in many ways from African Americans in religion and in culture. So the years of immigration of whole Azorean and whole Cape Verdean families to Nantucket only came after the days of whaling on Nantucket were over. And the magnet that pulled the Cape Verdean families here to Nantucket and to Cape Cod was commercial cranberry cultivation. Nantucket tried to find various ways to replace whaling, tried farming of various sorts. And they decided that the future lay in cranberry cultivation. So they created what was at the time the largest single cranberry bog in the world, just short of Sconset off the Milestone Road. And in 1910, when the federal census was taken on Nantucket, the Burgess Cranberry Company, which had built this big bog, was employing over 100 Cape Verdean men, women, and children to work the bog. And at the time the census was taken, many of them had only arrived in Nantucket within months. So this is what cranberry picking was like. This is dry picking, not the way we've been doing it more recently by flooding the bogs and knocking the berries off and scooping them up. This was hand picking with cranberry scoops or just by hand. So as it happened, the Cape Verdeans didn't have much in the way of material goods, but they had very rich tradition of storytelling. And many of the stories are rather typical African stories about how people or animals outsmart other people. There's one really good one, the tug of war between a whale and an elephant. And an early American woman anthropologist, Elsie Clews Parsons, was very interested in Cape Verdean oral culture. She later became famous for her work in the American Southwest, but to begin with, she was working in Providence, New Bedford, and she came to Nantucket. And she came with a Cape Verdean guy named Gregorio, we pronounce it Teixeira de Silva, and he'd been born in Fogo, and the two of them came here in 1916 to collect these kind of stories and riddles from Cape Verdean cranberry bog workers. This is the current Cape Verdean flag. So now I'm going to talk a little bit, not about Cape Verdeans in Cape Verde, but Cape Verdeans on Nantucket. Cape Verde got its independence, complete independence from Portugal in 1975, became a nation. And this current flag is 10 stars for the 10 islands against a blue background of the sea and sky. But they had an earlier flag, and that one was red, yellow, and green and has maize on it. And Nantucket had quite a few years of Nantucket Cape Verdean festivals, and the old flag was featured on their t-shirts. So here are a group of visitors to a Nantucket Cape Verdean festival, all in their festival t-shirts. And really, here on the island, there is a great dedication, devotion to the old flag. People sort of say, oh, the new flag, why did they have to go and do that? We love the old one. Well, when these visitors came to Nantucket for the festivals, they always stopped to have their photographs taken in front of this mural that's on the corner of Washington Street and Main Street. Well, why? Why do Cape Verdeans always have their pictures taken here when they come to visit? Well, because it tells you how far it is from here to Cape Verde. H. Marshall Gardner painted this mural, and he recognized this distance, and it's a form of recognition that Cape Verdeans really treasure. So this mural is so meaningful to them. So who are some of the Nantucket people that we can think of who are Cape Verdean? For instance, who is this dashing horseman? Movie star handsome. It is Augusto C. Ramos, Senior Citizen of the Year, the first person of color elected to the Board of Selectmen, businessman, man of a million accomplishments. And of those accomplishments, one of his proudest was he and his son Rookie poured concrete for the rebuilding of Great Point Lighthouse in 1986. The year before, a storm had knocked the lighthouse over. The Coast Guard was talking about just putting a beacon or something at Great Point, but Ted Kennedy pushed through Congress an appropriation to rebuild the lighthouse, and it was Augie and Rookie who poured the concrete. And they have a plaque out there. And Augie's name is second down from the top on the left, and Rookie's is third up from the bottom on the right. And Ted Kennedy is in there, but he's not anywhere near the top. I'm not sure how they organized the names on this plaque, but people are very proud of that. Another person that some of you may recall was Joe Lopes, who was the Nantucket dock master. If you came in with a boat and tied up at the dock, one of the many dock girls who worked for Joe Lopes was probably taking in your lines and asking you if you needed some ice. The dock girls apparently ran around with buckets of ice and alternatively tied up boats and provided people with ice for their cocktails. This is, to me, just a wonderful photographic portrait by the photographer Louis Davidson, who in the 50s photo documented many Nantucketers. And this is his portrait of John Coutures Barrows, who was a steamboat porter in the 50s. And here's a very recent photo of Rocky Fox, co-owner of the Chicken Box, a community activist who has raised millions of dollars for causes through benefits at the box, and now a member of the Nantucket Public School Committee and running for next month to be elected to a seat on that school committee. Go Rocky. And an even younger Nantucket Cape Verdean, Keziah Duarte. In this picture, she was winning the 2015 Distinguished Young Woman competition. And she's now both a musician and a healthcare professional for Nantucket, a young Nantucketer who is staying here and forging a future on Nantucket Island. For many more Nantucket Cape Verdeans and their history, an exhibition will be opening on June 18, just over there in this building, called Cape Verde in Our Soul. And it will run all the way through 2022. So I really hope that you will come to see it. But the other stream of Portuguese heritage is from the Azores. And here is their flag, stars for their islands, and a bird. It's a goshawk, and the name of the island is for that bird. They were known to Nantucketers as the Western Islands, although they're due east of Nantucket, but they're far out in the ocean west of European mainland. And they became an autonomous region of Portugal. So it's different. Cape Verde Islands are a nation, but the Azores are an autonomous region, but they do have their flag. And if you see on this map, you see how far away they are from the mainland and also how much closer they are to New England than they are to Brazil. So if you stand on the bank in Sconset and you look east, despite what this sign says, you shouldn't think nothing but sea from here to Spain. You should think next stop, the Azores. In the Azores, the island of Fayal and the town of Horta on Fayal was a whaling center. And even today, just like in Nantucket, you see representations of sperm whales just everywhere, as for instance, surrounding this window. And there's, as I showed you, the strait between the two islands before. Here you've got the same strait with a whale spout right there between the two islands. So a historian named Francis Chapin wrote that it's always being inside of the ocean that gives Azoreans the sense that you can go someplace else. And they did. And they did quite early. Some marriages between Portuguese men from the Azores and local women are documented before 1800. Around 1770, Antonio Soares, who became Anthony Swayze, married a Martha's Vineyard woman named Jerusha. And after they had a couple of children, they moved to Nantucket and had 10 more. And their son and his wife, Nantucket wife, had 8 children, and their granddaughter married yet another Azorean. So this was kept up. So when this original Anthony Swayze died at the Quays Asylum in 1835, he was 82 years old. And that means that when he and Jerusha began having that big family, he was actually still in his late teens. But here's another Anthony Swayze, or Antone Swayze. This couple are photographed in 1890. And the Swayze name just carried on through generations and generations on Nantucket. Some other examples: in 1796, John Sylvia married a Nantucket coffin, and 21 years later, their son married another Nantucketer. In 1831, John Lewis, a Portuguese, married Maria Gibbs of Nantucket, who was soon widowed because he was a whaleman and he was killed by a whale. And a year later, what did she do? She married another Portuguese husband. So none of these Portuguese men who settled on Nantucket were specifically identified which island in the Azores they had come from. But by the middle of the 1800s, the federal census and the Nantucket vital records were becoming more precise. So in 1850, there were 27 Azores-born men living on Nantucket, and 45 more men from the Azores were serving on Nantucket ships. And all but 5 of the resident Azorean men had Massachusetts-born wives. And we know they were Nantucket wives, right? And some of them had been already married for 20 years, and they had tended to have really big families. So the rule was that Azorean men, whalers, were marrying Nantucket women, but there was an exception because a Starbuck couple's son, James B. Starbuck, who was born in 1819, actually married a woman named Maria Sylvia, who was from Fayal. But then, after whaling had petered out here, all of a sudden, whole families in the Azores picked up and started moving west. And some of them went as far west as California, where there's a big Azorean population. Some of them went even further to the island of Maui in Hawaii. But many of them just came as far as Nantucket, because at that point, the economy was in the pits and many, many people had left. Nantucket had had a population of about 10,000 during the height of whaling, and it dropped like a rock to 3,000 or even below 3,000, and that created a lot of empty housing that was practically free, and the Azoreans moved into the available housing. And they thought that no matter how hard Nantucketers found life in Nantucket after whaling, they thought they could probably make some good from it. But why would they leave? They're islands that are very beautiful. They're never too hot. They're never too cold. And they're not dry like the Cape Verde Islands. So why would they pick up and leave? Well, there were some things that weren't so good because, it is volcanic and there were volcanic eruptions. They were really bothered by pirates who would raid the islands. And they had a surplus population because these Azorean families were big and the islands were of a fixed size. And after a few generations, as you divide what land you have between more and more descendants, well, somebody has to go. And so it was mainly adolescents and young adults who left home and traveled west looking for opportunity elsewhere, for instance, on Nantucket. But Nantucket also was free of 2 really mighty pests that were affecting the Azores at the time. One was the Phylloxera aphid, which is an American insect that destroys grapevines. And around the time that whaling was ending for Nantucket, this aphid crossed the Atlantic and just about wiped out the French wine industry. But the Azores had also been producing wine, particularly on the island of Pico, and they had been exporting their wine to the court of the Tsar of Russia. And now this aphid arrives and is destroying grapevines. And another blight, the island of San Miguel was exporting oranges in large numbers. They were getting rich on growing oranges and sending them to England. They actually have an orange street, just like we do. And actually, there's an orange street in New Haven, Connecticut as well. But the blight arrived in the middle of the 1800s, and it just wiped out the whole citrus industry. So there were a lot of people who had actually been doing very well until these two things happened. Well, what about Nantucket? What did they do on Nantucket? A lot of them went into the grocery business. They became farmers and landscapers. Some of them were millers. And Nantucket once had 4 windmills on a row. We call it Mill Hill, but it's a series of hills, hopsquatchet hills. But 3 of them had been demolished. When in 1855, an Azorean named John Enos, who came from the tiny western island of Flores, gave up whaling, and he took over the one remaining mill, Swain's Mill. And he ran it for 9 years, and he sold it to a fellow Azorean from the island of Graciosa. So that's what the mill looked like about then. But, milling was really becoming an anachronism. And the most recent owner of this mill was another whaleman turned grocer. And milling really wasn't his thing. So he turned it over to yet another Azorean who was a miller by profession. And here he is, John Francis Sylvia of Fayal, who managed to keep on grinding corn at that mill for another 26 years. And then he willed it to his brother and a nephew in Fayal, who had no interest in coming to Nantucket and running a mill. So they put it up for auction, and it was purchased by the Nantucket Historical Association and became known as the Old Mill, as it is known to this day. Well, now we're going to change color because these guys are all from the Azores. But blue, a Cape Verdean. A Cape Verdean whaleman named John Lewis Sr. had settled on Nantucket and married into Nantucket's African American community in New Guinea. And that his wife's family are all buried in the historic college cemetery in view of the mill. You can see in the background, you can see the veins of the mill. And his son, Joseph Lewis Sr., also apparently went at least on one whaling voyage. But, whaling was past. He lived on West York Street, right down, slightly downhill from the mill, and he became one of the Nantucket Historical Association's custodians of the old mill. Well, back to the Azoreans. The NHA has a lot of photos of Azorean immigrants, and I've just chosen a few of them. This is the Mendoza family who were here in 1898. Another Sylvia. It seems that no matter what their names were, the men became Frank Sylvia or Tony Sylvia, and the women became Mary Sylvia. So this is Frank Sylvia and his wife, photographed in 1882. Manuel Mendoza first came to the USA at the age of 12 as a messboy on a whale ship. And in New Bedford, he met his Louisa, who had been born in the Azores. And this is a photograph of her taken in the 1890s. So they moved to Nantucket and started a grocery store. They had 2 children, John and Mary, who I knew very well. John went to Harvard, and then he taught in New York City. And Mary taught 6th grade at Academy Hill School in Nantucket for 30 years, and she was my 6th grade teacher, but I met Louisa at their home, and I recorded John telling some wonderful stories. Well, back in the 1860s, a guy named João Santos, who was born on Graciosa, He left Graciosa, settled on Nantucket, and changed his name to John Murray. Why he chose John Murray, who knows? But as Captain John Murray, he was master of the whaling schooner, the Abbey Bradford, out of Nantucket. But whaling was pretty much dead. So in 1869, he decided he was going to retire from the sea. So he took the Abbey Bradford across to the Azores, picked up his son and daughter-in-law from the island of Graciosa, came here, and what did they do? They opened a grocery store on Nantucket's Orange Street. The young Murrays were soon sworn in as American citizens, and father and son became very influential in the Nantucket Azorean community, but beyond that, in the Nantucket community in general. So there's John Murray Jr. and his wife, Anna. His photo was taken 10 years before her photo was taken, but you can see that they are handsome, prosperous young people. And they were instrumental in building Alfonso Hall on Cherry Street, which later was named Knights of Columbus Hall, and then was named Father Griffin Hall, but I think we all know it as Knights of Columbus Hall. And it was so that they could continue to celebrate the Azorean Feast of the Holy Spirit. So in one picture, you see it newly built, and then the other one, you see it's been duded up a bit. But this looks nothing like the little buildings all over the Azores that are dedicated to the Feast of the Holy Spirit, because they are plastered and decorated and painted, usually blue and white. And look at Alfonso Hall. It was built with Nantucket in mind. It's shingled. And that was where a lot of dancing took place outdoors around the building. And Eileen McGrath taught me this little jingle that she had learned. The shades of night were falling fast when round Consu McGinty passed on his way to Alfonso Hall to shake his leg and have a ball. Part of the fest was carrying a crown. And so they sent to Portugal for this crown, which was used in the procession every year from St. Mary's Church on Federal Street, down Orange Street, and around to Cherry Street. We have photos of these processions of Azoreans. And the crown remains today. I photographed it in St. Mary's Rectory. So much coming to me. Here are some of the Portuguese family names that I have found in Nantucket records. There is an awful lot. And some of these names are shared by both Azorean families and Cape Verdean families. Some of them are really typically Cape Verdean, like Jibo and Lobo and Lopes in Nantucket. You can be pretty sure someone with that name is Cape Verdean, but there are other names that are shared. You just don't know. You have to meet the person. So these are the things that Nantucket received as gifts from Portuguese immigrants from the Azores and from the Cape Verde Islands. First and foremost, labor. Labor in the whale ships, labor in the cranberry bogs, labor in the fishing fleet, countless pursuits on land and water. Service in the US Life-Saving Service, service in the lightship and lighthouse service, and every branch of the military. They've made contributions to us in education, healthcare, business. Have given us linguiça, Portuguese bread, and kale. They have made contributions on island to music, both traditional music and contemporary music. Although at one time, St. Mary's Church would not permit Cape Verdeans to be married in the church, but required that because they were people of color, they had to be married in the rectory. That all changed in the 1950s, and the Cape Verdean and Azorean populations have been a tremendous sort to St. Mary's Church. And finally, they've given us hydrangeas everywhere. So here's 3 pictures. Cape Verdean manchoop made with kale and linguiça. Lee Topham Ramos made this for us and photographed it. Portuguese bread, what would we do without it? How could Nantucket be Nantucket without Portuguese bread? And finally, the hydrangeas, the blue billows. So in the end, there's so much more to Nantucket's Portuguese heritage. So last year in 2021, we celebrated Nantucket's Cape Verdean heritage at a show called Shoulders on Which We Stand here in the Whaling Museum. And the celebration continues in 2022 with a new show, Cape Verde and Our Soul. But you know, Nantucket's Azorean heritage remains to be celebrated right here sometime, I hope, in the very near future. Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to take some questions now. And is there, I'm going to start here. Anyone here have a question? All right, I have a question, of course. Has there been, what is the relationship between the Portuguese, the Azoreans and the Cape Verde communities been? Like, are they congenial? Are they competitive? Because like you've broken them apart for us, but do they see this among themselves?
I think they have stood quite apart from each other for many reasons. And I mean, to be frank, one is color. Also, the Cape Verdean community, I think, really strives hard to maintain its own identity. So they really very much hope to remain a unitary community, but of course it's so small, it's very hard to do that. And they're all one big family now. Rocky Fox said whenever he met a girl that he sort of wanted to date, he'd have to go home and ask his parents first, is she a cousin? And the fact of the matter is they're all cousins. The Azorean community is a little older. It got established here. There were many more families. And by this time, there are even more generations into being Nantucketers.
There you said, and I know this is true, there are Brazilians coming
Yes.
to Nantucket. Now, does that have anything to do with the fact that these people from the Azores have come, or is that just?
Well, I've been told that the food is so different that they said, let's have some good Portuguese food. And then what is this? Yeah, I think that our new Brazilian community is evolving its own identity. After all, they're from a big mainland country, and the Azorians and the Cape Verdeans are both from little groups of islands.
Fran, we have a question from our virtual audience. Does Nantucket have larger representations of these populations than, say, Bermuda or New Bedford, Fall River, and elsewhere?
I don't know anything at all about Cape Verdeans in Bermuda, but Nantucket's emigration stopped a long time ago. So the people who are here are the descendants of the people who came here. Whereas there's been a lot of ongoing immigration to Boston, New Bedford, et cetera. And so those communities are really quite different and much more in touch with where they came from.
We do. We have a question here. Just want to say thank you. Always great to learn more about this history. Another question. One thing I have noticed on the island is a lack of restaurants focusing on the amazing Azorean and our Cape Verdean food. Was there ever Portuguese restaurants on Nantucket?
I don't think there has been, but the question was, have there been Azorean or Cape Verdean restaurants on Nantucket? And, it's a funny thing because food is so incredibly important, particularly in the interviews that we've been doing with Cape Verdean Nantucketers this winter. And yet, no, there hasn't been an Azorean or a Cape Verdean restaurant here yet. Never can tell. Might change.
I think that one of the last businesses that was owned and run a food business was Rabimbus's on Pleasant Street.
Yes.
With Frank, I grew up, my mother was Madeline Perry. My dad was Joe Perry. My family was from Fayal in the Azores. And my grandparents, Flora and Joseph, emigrated here as indentured servants. And then my grandparents actually sponsored Barbara Kodalak's grandparents to come over at that point in time. But Frank was I grew up in the house right next to him, to the business, and Frank was a mason who moved to the United States. And when he found out that I was going to college in Wellesley, Mass at Mass Bay, he said, Maria, you have to go to the church. I built that church. You have to get pictures for me. So I did. And he, if anyone remembers him, smoking his big stogie, pricing everything, counting everything out, using his pencil on a piece of brown paper bag. And that's where we always had our linguiça, Gaspar's linguiça and Charisse, right from Frank.
Yeah.
One more question. When did the last major immigration come to Nantucket? Or is it now just descendants?
Really, when the immigration caps were, quotas were put on right after World War I, it made it much more difficult to immigrate then. And that's why the Nantucket Cape Verdeans and the Nantucket Azoreans are multi-generation descendants of people who came before then.
All right, so I want to thank Francis. Thank you so much. It was, did I lie to you, or I told you you're going to learn something? And I just want to also give a little plug to the new exhibit. It's going, as it's been mentioned, it's called Cape Verde in Our Souls. It's opening in June. It's a continuation of the celebration of our Cape Verde Nantucket connection. It's going to have historic photos, mementos, and a little mini theater presenting short films, short interviews based on recently conducted oral histories of some of our Cape Verde communities. So you'll have to come back and visit, see that exhibit. I thank you all for coming tonight. Those of you who are here in person, those of you who have loyally joined us from across the country. And we thank our members who make these programs possible, and we were able to present them at no charge. To become a member, go to nha.org. It's really quite simple. So have a fabulous spring and summer. It will come eventually, and we'll see you next season, next winter, next year. Good night.